You believe silence is the absence of sound, a pause between moments of speech, a space where nothing is said and nothing happens. But what if silence is not a break, but a form of communication itself? Ibn Arabi questioned this assumption. He said that silence is not emptiness, but the ground in which all meaning unfolds. When you stop speaking, it is not the world that quiets. It is your own thinking that releases its grip. Only then can you begin to hear what is always present. Silence, he said, is God's most direct form of expression, but it cannot be heard by the ear. If silence is not the end of conversation, could it be the beginning of revelation? Ibn Arabi lived in 12th century Andalusia, when philosophy and revelation wrestled for authority. Scholars debated logic, language, and proof, while mystics sought direct knowing. Ibn Arabi stood between them. He accepted reason, but pointed beyond it. He taught that knowledge cannot be reduced to words, because words are only reflections of understanding, not its source. Silence, for him, was not ignorance or passivity. It was the medium through which truth discloses itself, not as a statement, but as awareness itself. He taught that speech belongs to intellect, but silence belongs to being. You speak to maintain order. You explain, describe, and define to keep meaning intact. But every act of speech already divides what was whole. Ibn Arabi warned that speech, when driven by the need to assert or clarify, merely repeats what is already known. The mind speaks to protect its continuity. Yet what is real cannot be preserved through repetition. When every thought must be expressed, what space remains for what has not yet appeared? If understanding depends on words, then you are condemned to live within the boundaries of what can be spoken. What, then, becomes of all that cannot be said? You assume listening is a physical act, the reception of sounds, the decoding of meanings. But Ibn Arabi described a deeper listening, the readiness of being to receive reality as it is. In this kind of hearing, you are not the listener, but the field in which listening occurs. To listen in silence is not to strain for sound, but to allow awareness to become receptive. What you hear is not a voice, but the unfolding of existence itself. The question is not whether God speaks, but whether your hearing is prepared to recognize that everything already speaks His word. For Ibn Arabi, creation itself is speech, the eternal word taking form in multiplicity. Every being is a syllable in that infinite utterance. The world is not a collection of objects. It is divine language appearing as reality. Speech, in this sense, is not what humans invented. It is what existence already is. But when human beings speak without awareness, they forget that their words originate from this same creative source. They begin to use language as ownership, not participation. Silence is the return to that original ground of speech. It is not rejection of expression, but its purification, the point where words remember where they came from. When you attempt to hear the silence Ibn Arabi described, the mind interferes. It begins to comment, interpret, and evaluate. You do not hear the world. You hear your thinking about the world. Ibn Arabi warned that this inner commentary is the veil that conceals divine communication. The more you interpret, the less you listen. The more you analyze, the more you reinforce the barrier between knower and known. The noise is not outside you. It is the echo of your own voice. To hear God, you must first hear how continuously you speak to yourself and how rarely you listen. Ibn Arabi called the discipline of silence sukun, stillness. It is not passivity, but a form of active receptivity. In this state, perception stops chasing objects and rests within awareness itself. He described it as the science of letting reality disclose itself without interference. Thought does not vanish. It becomes transparent. Awareness no longer seeks, it recognizes. Stillness allows knowledge to arise without reasoning. Meaning no longer needs to be constructed. It becomes self-evident. The less you add, the more truth appears. In that equilibrium, God's speech is not something you hear. It is something you realize, the recognition that the very act of being conscious is already divine communication. When words no longer seem necessary, silence begins to speak in its own way. You sense that meaning continues even when language ends. Ibn Arabi wrote that silence is God's speech to the heart, a form of revelation that uses no symbols. What you call nothing is not absence. It is pure presence unmediated by form. The mind seeks to translate this presence into words, but every translation diminishes it. The silence of God cannot be spoken because it is what makes speaking possible. The one who can rest in that understanding begins to hear what cannot be named. And in that hearing, knowledge appears without effort, without sound, without thought. Speech returns, but not as before. After silence, words no longer serve the self. They serve truth. Ibn Arabi said that the perfected human does not speak about reality. He speaks from it. Such speech arises without intention. It is simply the continuation of divine articulation through a conscious being. When speech follows silence, it no longer divides. It reveals. You realize that the aim of silence was never to escape words, but to purify them, to let them speak only what already is. The word that emerges from silence carries no claim, no argument. It is transparent to its source. There comes a point where hearing is no longer sensory. You begin to recognize awareness itself as a medium of communication. Every perception, every thought, every encounter is a transmission. Ibn Arabi called this the hearing of the heart. It is not listening to something, but listening as something, the awareness through which all meaning passes. To hear God is not to receive a message. It is to recognize that the act of hearing itself belongs to the divine. Sound and silence both dissolve here, for the listener and the source are the same reality seen from two sides of awareness. You now understand that silence and speech are not opposites. They are two expressions of one movement, revelation and return. When the self ceases to claim ownership of speech, silence becomes the background of all meaning. Ibn Arabi's hidden method was never about external quiet. It was about freeing awareness from the need to interpret, define, or divide. In that freedom, all things are heard as God. Silence is not withdrawal. It is participation without interference. To hear God is not to wait for a voice, but to awaken to the understanding that you have never heard anything else. In that realization, there is no sound left to seek, only the stillness of knowing.